Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade on this Tuesday morning. We are live. I'm Michelle Edmonds from Idaho News 6. So nice to have you joining us once again. Kevin and I were just talking. Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Kevin, it has been a year, my friend. We've been seeing the anniversaries of the coronavirus, not only in the United States, but here in Idaho, and marked those occasions, of course, across the Idaho News 6 platform and the Idaho Education News platforms. And here we are still in a virtual world. And yet, there's such positive news. And when we talk about education, and we will get to so many interesting topics, but good news again on the K-12 front when you're covering how many cases are in our public school system. It's pretty much flat.
It remains flat and has for the past couple of weeks. I mean, we're talking flat to the point where the numbers were identical last week as opposed to the previous week. So if you're looking for that kind of stabilizing, if you wanted to see the numbers stabilize, they've certainly done that over the past several weeks. And what we're seeing with the K-12 numbers, what we saw with the higher education numbers this week is a lot of the new cases are centered in two parts of the state right now, Ada County and Bonneville County. A lot of the hotspots in the K-12 system are schools in Ada and Bonneville counties. When you look at the higher education numbers, which we did on Monday, you had case increases at Boise State University and also the College of Eastern Idaho, the new two-year school in Idaho Falls. So a lot of the numbers statewide have really stabilized, and we do that analysis every Friday, and we look at what's happening with the statewide case numbers. A lot of flat numbers all across the state. Increases still in Ada County and Bonneville County. Two of the larger counties in the state, sure, but you are seeing some pretty sharp increases, especially in Eastern Idaho and in counties like Bonneville.
And what about when it comes to our college campuses? Because I know you keep a close eye on those numbers as well.
Flat in some cases, increasing in other areas. Boise State had an increase in cases last week. College of Eastern Idaho in Idaho Falls had a fairly significant increase in cases. Still low number of cases because it's a smaller campus, but definitely an increase. So what you're seeing on the campuses, kind of like what you're seeing with the K-12 schools, is reflective of what we're seeing in the larger communities. Isolated areas where the case numbers are increasing more rapidly than in other parts of the state.
Some interesting news coming out of Idaho State University, though. They are looking to go full in-person learning come this August for the fall. And this is, I believe, the first Idaho university to make this kind of decision. Is that correct, Kevin?
I believe so. I think that the other colleges and universities are definitely leaning towards a full reopen in the fall and certainly hoping for a full reopen in the fall. But ISU came out last week and said, based on what's happening right now with the vaccinations, with the availability of vaccinations, ISU anticipates that everybody in the university community should be able to be fully vaccinated by August when the school year reopens. So they're hoping to have a full reopen.
It's exciting news. We started off this saying that we've now passed the 1-year anniversary of the two of us not seeing each other in person. And, it's nice to be able to hear that we are finally perhaps on the backside of this pandemic. Everybody, of course, crossing their fingers with the variants that are happening, but it is really some good news coming out of, both the K-12 system and the higher education system.
And all we're trying to do right now at our level is just to sort of track the numbers and track the trends, because it really feels right now like it's a race between the vaccines and the variants. And what we're seeing with the vaccination numbers at the state level, pretty steady in numbers of vaccinations the past couple of weeks, and that is anticipated to increase as more vaccines become available.
Let's hop on over to the legislature, because there is so much to be covering as the legislature literally begins to wind down, and we're seeing kind of the last of the push from the education committees. They're supposed to be wrapping up their work basically this week. And Kevin, I want to jump in first and foremost to what happened this morning, because something came out of JFAC this morning that should perk up the ears of a lot of people after what they heard 2 weeks ago. And that's that the early education grant from the federal government is now back in play. So tell us what happened with the budget committee today.
Well, what you saw with the budget committee is the emergence of a new bill that would basically do what the first bill did. It would authorize the State Board of Education and the Idaho chapter of the Association for the Education of Young Children to spend $6 million of federal money. This is a $6 million federal grant that the state has already been approved for, that would be spent over the course of 3 years to try to build early education partnerships and programs all over the state. As you remember, 2 weeks ago, this came up on the House floor. The bill that, again, would authorize these agencies to spend money that's already been approved at the federal level. The House turned that down, put the $6 million grant in limbo. Well, here we are 2 weeks later. The bill from the Budget Committee, the bill from JFAC, doesn't change the amount of money. The grant is the same. The spending authority is the same. The partnership between the state board and early childhood education advocates is unchanged. The only thing that's changed here is that there's language in the bill that's designed to place some limits about how the money would be spent, make clear that curriculum decisions are going to be made at the local level. It makes it clear that any kind of new early education program that is launched with this federal grant, the state is not on the hook to continue funding it once the federal money runs out. So there are some sideboards, there are some restrictions that are placed on the grant. We'll see. This bill died on the House floor essentially on a tie vote. It really is a matter of advocates hanging on to the votes that they had on March 2nd and trying to get maybe one or two House members to change their vote from no to yes. That's how close it was to passing. Will this language do enough to win over a couple of skeptics on the House side? That's what we'll see, and we'll see it probably in the next few days when this comes up for a House vote. What we saw in JFAC this morning really doesn't tell you a whole lot necessarily. Ron Nate, a Republican from Rexburg, one of the real conservative hardliners on the House side, has been an opponent of this grant from the beginning. He was an opponent of the new bill and raised a lot of the same concerns that we heard on the House floor 2 weeks ago. So, no, he wasn't won over. Priscilla Giddings, another conservative on JFAC, she wasn't won over. I wouldn't have expected them to change their votes. They have been very adamant on this issue. The question is what happens when it gets to the House floor, because, again, this essentially it died on a tie vote. When you got right down to it, there were some procedural maneuvers that affected the outcome of the vote, but the House is pretty much evenly split right now on this grant.
And we should back up and say once it died on the House floor, there was rumblings, including a small protest that took place the day later with people really upset that this bill had been killed. Is that why it got back to JFAC? Was it the public sway and public opinion?
I think that probably was a factor, because you're right, there was a protest on the State House steps the day after the vote. There was a lot of backlash directed at Shirley Shepard, a new legislator from North Central Idaho, first-year legislator, who in his floor debate suggested that he doesn't like early education programs because it makes it easier for mothers to leave the home. That comment really stirred up a backlash, and I think was kind of the driving force behind the protest you saw on the State House steps. But I'm not trying to diminish that aspect of the debate whatsoever, but to a lot of folks, the debate about this grant and this debate about early education really comes back to the issue of early reading. It comes back to the literacy issue. This is why Governor Little has been a supporter of these federal early education grants, where Governor Butch Otter didn't want anything to do with it over 12 years. Governor Little sees early education and early education partnerships as part and parcel to try to get third graders reading at grade level. So that's a big part of this debate as well. That didn't come up as much, I don't think, on the House floor 2 weeks ago, but I think that's definitely a factor in the debate. I think that's definitely a reason why supporters have been pushing so hard for this funding.
And we should make mention that that lawmaker who made the comments about mothers staying at home apologized.
Yes, he did. He apologized on the House floor the next day. That's right.
Well, let's talk about, I'm going to jump into more of the issue, because we'll see over the next couple of days, as you said, whether or not this early learning grant, money that's coming from the federal government that is just waiting to be used in Idaho, $6 million, whether or not the House moves this one forward or not. And we'll continue to cover that right here on Idaho News 6 and on Making the Grade. And of course, idahoednews.org, the place to go. I loved even getting your little text, Kevin, this morning after you put out your story. So I appreciate that. But let's go to your learning to read story, because if you want to take a deep dive into why all of these issues are so important, number one, it has to go to the fact that we have half of our kindergartners not showing up at school for kindergarten ready to learn how to read. And again, whenever we talk about learning to read with kindergartners, we're not talking about kindergartners actually reading words. This is being ready to understand and recognize letters and what to learn how to read. I just want to make that very clear as people are commenting today. But this is the learning to read, where lawmakers stand on this, where the governor has stood with early literacy, as you have said. Governor Little has been a huge proponent of it. He's even wanting a $20 million summer reading program to come out of the legislature right now. So there is a lot mixed up in this. It's not just this early learning grant that has the attention of lawmakers this year.
Yeah, so let's shift gears a little bit to the summer reading program and that $20 million proposal. So I wrote this story that you saw on the screen there. I wrote that the day before that summer reading program came up in the budget committee. So that story appeared on Thursday. Then on Friday, the budget committee got together, and that was the day when they wrote up the K-12 budget bills. And those are the ones, 7 bills in all, plus some supplemental bills. I mean, there's a mess of spending bills this year for public schools. When it came down to making the decision about what to do with the summer reading program, what the budget committee wound up doing was they did fund the $20 million program that Governor Little wants, but they took it a little bit further. They want another $10 million in essence to go into other programs to deal with other aspects of learning loss. And I think what you're hearing from the legislature, and I don't think you'd get an argument from Governor Little about this either, but what you're definitely hearing from the legislators is we know that there's been learning loss in the K-12 system. We know that it's happening all over the place, just by virtue of the fact that learning has been so interrupted over the past year. So what the legislators want to do is, okay, they want to fund early reading. They want to fund the summer reading program. The budget committee was very, very clear about that. But they want to put another $10 million into other aspects of learning loss in K-12. That may be the higher grades, that may be the middle school grades. That may take on a different form entirely. Again, all of these budget bills now have to go before the House and the Senate. K-12 budget bills over the past few years have been very widely supported on the House floor and on the Senate floor. There hasn't been a whole lot of opposition to most of these K-12 spending bills. So, if that's any indication, you would think that there's going to be pretty widespread support for what the budget committee was talking about with learning loss and what they're talking about in the bigger picture for K-12 spending, where we start to talk about teacher salaries, where we start to talk about advanced opportunity programs, where we start to talk about classroom technology, all of those line items that we've been discussing over the past few years.
Kevin, is it easier, and I'm not sure that's the correct word, I realize that, but is this an easier year for lawmakers to put money into literacy and advanced opportunities and technology because there's an influx of federal money that has come into the state because of the coronavirus pandemic, stimulus plan, and will continue with the latest stimulus package?
I think that's definitely a factor. I think that what you saw with the budget committee on Tuesday, on Friday, when they did the K-12 budgets, is a reflection of the fact that, yes, millions upon millions of dollars of federal money is coming in specifically to fund education during the pandemic. So for JFAC to put another $10 million into learning loss, well, that's going to come from some of that federal funding. And we haven't begun to even talk about what kind of federal funding could come in the next wave of stimulus. The stimulus law that President Biden signed into law last week, we know that it's going to bring in according to the estimates, more than $400 million more for K-12 in Idaho, upwards of $200 million into higher education. So the Budget Committee and the legislature in general is going to try to get their arms wrapped around, well, what are we going to do with all this money? You saw bits and pieces of that in the Budget Committee last week.
So just so people understand, what the Budget Committee is working with right now is the stimulus plan that was passed before last week, correct? I mean, you're talking about
exactly. This budget bill, it goes back to the last stimulus bill that was passed in December, that was signed into law by then President Trump right before the new year. President Biden just signed that last stimulus law last week. The money that's starting to trickle to individual taxpayers that's coming out, but also this huge influx of money that's coming to the states for education. So I think budget writers, I think legislators are just beginning to try to come to grips with it.
We'll have to wait until the next legislative session to see where all of those hundreds of millions end up. How does that work?
Well, there are rumblings right now, and we'll see how it plays out, that the legislature might wrap up its business as best it can with the money that it has now been spoken for, going back maybe to the December stimulus money and recess. So there's talk of the legislature maybe wrapping up its work here in the next couple of weeks for the time being. And then once this new influx of federal money comes in, there are legislators who want to come back to town and have more of a say about how that money is spent. Because if you go back a year ago, and you go back to the very first federal stimulus law, the CARES Act that was passed, upwards of now a year ago, end of March 2020, you still got a lot of legislators who feel like they didn't have enough of a say about how that money was spent. And they feel that the governor rolled that money out with little oversight, with little input from legislators. And I think you've got legislators who don't want to see that happen again. They don't want to be cut out of the process again. They feel like they were cut out of the process. I think that's their words, not mine. So I think you may have legislators say, we want to come back to town in a few weeks when that money really does roll in so that they can be a part of the decision-making process. That's not set in stone yet, but that's definitely in discussion right now.
That'd be fascinating. The legislature came back, last summer when Governor Little.
They came back last summer for that special session. This would be a little bit different animal. And I do not recall a session quite like what is being contemplated in terms of recessing and coming back to focus on federal spending. It would be most unusual.
Real quickly, before we leave early education, the money that could possibly go into it. So we've talked about this federal grant and how JFAC now has a bill along those lines. And Governor Little and his 20 million perhaps plus because of JFAC, adding another 10 million to the summer reading proposal. There was another bill that is, I believe, still making its way through the legislature right now about all-day kindergarten and focusing on trying to help pay for all-day kindergarten for folks who need that help or districts who want to offer it. Is that still in the works?
It is, and we're keeping an eye on what happens from here. The first version of that bill came out last week. It's going to get a rewrite from what I understand. I don't know when that bill is going to come up again. I mean, we said that it was going to resurface on Tuesday. It actually didn't. House State Affairs did not take it up today. We're watching those calendars to see when it will come up. What the supporters of this all-day kindergarten program are saying is that they want to give districts more of an option to launch full-day kindergarten programs. But part of what they want to do here is give the districts the option to expand into all-day kindergarten with the hope that the districts wind up using state dollars for all-day kindergarten and rely less on supplemental levies, on local tax levies to pay for all-day kindergarten. We were just here a week ago talking about the spate of supplemental levies that were on the ballot, and most of them passed, a few of them failed. A lot of districts around the state use those supplemental levy dollars for a lot of different reasons, and one of the most popular purposes is to pay for all-day kindergarten, because right now, all you get from the state is funding for a half a day of kindergarten. If you want to do more at the district level, you got to figure out how to pay for it yourself. So that's where supplemental levies come into the picture in a lot of school districts around the state. What these legislators are talking about with an all-day kinder bill is, let's figure out a way that the state will start to pay those costs. And it could be tens of $millions a year of additional costs that the state incurs. So early in the legislative process for that bill, as we're late in the legislative session, so it's a little bit of a race against time. We'll see how far it gets, and we'll see if it makes its way all the way through both houses.
Kevin, let's just real quickly touch on a couple others that you and I have been talking about here on Making the Grade. Virtual schools. We've talked about the influx of students into the virtual school systems for this past year because of the pandemic. Those virtual schools, online schools, needing more money so that they can hire more staff to deal with all the students. Where does that bill stand? They were trying to get some almost, I don't know if you would call it emergency funding, but they were trying to get an extra influx of cash to those schools as quickly as possible.
Yeah, emergency funding is a good way to look at it. That whole issue looks like it's pretty close to resolution. The houses have basically agreed on what they want to do for these two fast-growing virtual schools. JFAC on Friday, when they were going through all of those K-12 budgets, again, this was another aspect of the budgets that came out, decided they'd like to spend $6.1 million, I think is the exact figure, of federal coronavirus stimulus money to offset those added costs for those virtual schools. So it looks right now, barring some hiccup along the way, that issue is going to be taken care of before the session adjourns.
And the one other bill you and I about, sex education, sexy topic, right? But now they're looking at a possible bill to have parents opt in to sex education instead of opting out if you want that for your child. So this is a bill that's been going through at least the House. I'm wondering where it stands.
It's before Senate Education. It was scheduled to come up in Senate Education on Monday. Senate Education had a pretty long agenda and only an hour to meet on Monday because the Senate was going back into session. So they didn't get to the sex ed bill. The plan now is to get to it on Wednesday. Senate Education wants to wrap up all of its committee work this week. So they're really kind of under the clock. So today, Tuesday afternoon, Senate Education is going to take up that private school scholarship bill that we've talked about. That's going to come up for a vote. That's going to be very interesting hearing to watch. And then you've got sex education scheduled to come up on Wednesday. Then on Thursday, Senate Education will take up that bill that would allow rural districts to come up with their own local approach to certifying teachers that essentially would allow these districts, if they're really struggling to hire teachers, to hire somebody with a bachelor's degree who may not have any teaching experience or specific training in teaching to fill some of those hard to fill positions. All three of those bills have passed the House. None of them have passed the Senate. They all have to get out of the Senate Education Committee. So we'll be watching Senate Education very closely the next 3 afternoons.
Whew, busy week.
Yeah.
All right, you want to take any bets on when the legislature ends? Come on, we have to do our like March Madness now that it's out, right? It's the March Madness of the legislature. You want to have a bet?
I think that there's probably a chance that they could adjourn the end of next week. I think that that's a realistic schedule given what the legislature still has to do, what they have to do in the way of budget bills. But there is a lot still going on. We've talked about all of these education bills. The House Revenue and Taxation Committee this morning, our Sammy Edge was watching this hearing, took action and recommended and sent to the House floor a big tax cut bill that will now get a House vote in the next few days, I would imagine. A lot of legislators want to leave town with some kind of tax relief on the books. Governor Little wants to get tax relief this session. What it looks like and whether both houses agree on what tax relief looks like, that's often a tough thing to do. There's often a lot of disagreement between the House and the Senate about what to do with tax legislation. But you got legislators, a lot of them, who don't want to leave town with that issue unresolved. So, there's just a spate of issues at the State House right now. They could be done within a couple of weeks. They could be done by the end of next week. It's feasible. It's conceivable. But I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it.
I won't hold you to it, I promise. No. I never do.
Not a small amount of money, maybe. Not that I admit, because I don't feel that confident.
Well, if you want to read up on all of these stories and continue to follow the latest news coming out of the legislature, as you heard in the next 2 weeks, there are a ton of bills that could make a real difference to you, your student, teachers, no matter what you believe with education and what's happening in this state. There could be some major changes headed our way in the next year. So if you want to keep up with all that, idahoednews.org, the place to go. You can load the app and get Kevin's latest information as it pushes right to your phone. Totally appreciate that. Kevin, thank you for being here, for making the grade, taking the time. I know you have a busy, busy week ahead of you.
Thank you, Michelle. Have a good week and stay safe.
Will do. Thanks for being here, for making the grade, everybody.